We have been here a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And, we're all here about taking care of it so that our great, great, great grandkids can do the same. And that's why the sustainability and the thought of the oyster as a protein source is one of the most sustainable proteins you can get in the animal kingdom. And even as far as sustainability and amount of energy input, water, etc., when you're thinking about growing things as a protein source, even veg-based, oyster really comes into that neutrality where you can get fabulous protein returns for very little input. And I've got a couple, there was a paper last season, November, that came out that talked about, they compared the protein and CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of major protein sources, cow, pig, chicken, and oyster. Oyster came in negative. There was 0 to just under nothing. And then chicken was next, then pig, then beef was way up here. So, and the theory of this paper was written, the professor who did it said, if the United States would consider replacing just 10% of their beef intake with oyster, they would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 11 million cars a year. And so it's one of those, and they're easy to grow. The other paper that I read, which was brilliant, was Namibia. Down in South Africa, they needed to raise protein for their people. What are we going to feed our people? How are we going to? They did a great analysis of different farms, different ideas of what they would grow. They came out with oyster. Oyster was the best method because ocean feeds the whole thing. You just hold the little things in one little area, and a year to 2 years later, you pull it out and you sell it and eat it. And so it worked really, really well. And so it was one of those early papers that I read in early 2000, and I know they've been going along since then too. So it's kind of fun. It grows everywhere. But really being sustainable, ocean sustainability, but also environmentally sustainable as far as a protein source to feed our growing population.
Well, I think what I loved about your book was you talked about how you don't need to feed them when you farm them. You don't need to give them water. You don't need to give them antibiotics. You don't need electricity. And I mean, we love the idea of, there's a big controversy, I think, in Canada at the moment about farmed salmon and the problem with
all over the world.
Yeah,
yep.
Genetically modifying salmon to farm, which is, potentially a huge disaster if they escape and contaminate the pool of wild salmon. And we get wild salmon in Australia, thankfully, from Canada, the wild frozen salmon, which is a fabulous source for us. But of course, there is a problem with the farmed fish that you have to feed them, and you're feeding them a not natural diet, and you have to give them antibiotics because they're so crowded. Yet oyster farming doesn't have any of those problems. And would you see that as one of the great beauties about oyster farms?
That's the actual technical beauty of oyster farms. It's the most environmentally sustainable farming that you can do, even in a high intensity. You're just corralling them. You're holding them into a little area, and you're doing something to manipulate the shell so it will grow nicely for the consumer. And it's just because you're growing it at the top of the water versus the bottom. That's why they float them. That's where the phytoplankton highly concentrates, where there's more sunshine. And that's why you float your oysters at the top of the water, and you just flip the little bags, tumbling the stuff. That's all you do. You do start oysters out in the laboratory. If you're going to be an aquaculturist, an actual farmer, you can start by breeding little oysters. You get the best of the oysters. You allow them to breed out. You let the spat set, and then you can grow and propagate algae for them to feed on for the first 3 or 4 weeks to 16 weeks, and then you send them out. Bye, it's gone. And then 2 years later is when you get the oyster to market grade size. So it's all Mother Nature after that, and it's based on the region, where you're doing it, and then the level. Again, back to the flavoring, the finishing of the oyster, you can actually change the flavor finish of it and the profile if you keep it at the top of the water, or you keep it in the mid, or you put it down on the bottom. And back to France, where they grow clair finished pool oysters, where you'll get the green gill oyster, la fin de clair verte. The green gilled oyster is where the green algae blossoms right now in the summertime in these high tide pools in Rennes d'Orléans and other little areas where they've made this region where the algae will grow naturally in the ponds, and you feed the best oysters in there, they get green gills. It looks like your leaves right behind you. So normally consumers don't look at that and go, oh, that in North America, they go, oh, green, that's going to be, it's like when blue cheese was first invented. It was like, blue cheese, what's that moldy stuff? You can't eat that. No, 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 no. When the gourmands, they're like, no, green gill, I'll take those ones. Thank you very much. There's a couple of growers now in North America that are doing a green gilled oyster because naturally they can in North Carolina, and there's one in Prince Edward Island, one little region that I can do in PEI as well. So it's kind of neat, but really crazy flavors that you can do on it.